This video will contain spoilers for the entire Chandra run. In August of 2018, IDW Publishing announced Magic: The Gathering Chandra, with issue 1 to be published the following November. By all accounts, it should have been a home run. It starred one of Magic's most popular characters, with a few other fan favorites thrown in too. The creative team had various hits under their respective belts. It was to take place after the much talked about upcoming War of the Spark set. To make a comparison with another franchise, imagine how much more hype there would be if the already hotly anticipated Spider-Man Far From Home was released before Endgame, while still taking place after it. Going back to Chandra, at first it seemed like it was going to be that home run. Discussion and speculation were running high after the first issue's final revelation. And then, nothing. Sales declined with each entry in the series. The announced sequel, Trials of Alara, was quietly cancelled. Mentioning the series is met with equal amounts of apathy and surprise it was even a thing. With so much promise and potential, Magic: The Gathering Chandra burnt away, like some sort of person that is famous for being on fire. Burnt away like the Human Torch. Yeah, that'll do. Join me as I uncover just why no one read the Chandra comic. Please watch this. I had to email strangers for it. As a young person, that's my greatest fear. Possibility 1. The comic was just bad. Perhaps the simplest explanation for the Chandra comic underperforming is that it was just straight up bad. No one liked it, so no one recommended it, so it died an unmourned death. But is that actually a fair assessment? Kind of. Chandra is really a solid 3 out of 5 if I ever saw one. The highs aren't groundbreaking, the lows aren't experience ruining. There is nothing to object to, but there's also nothing to excite you. Let me get into more detail. Since my reaction to the comic is so mixed, I'm going to do my review in a compliment sandwich format, something I like followed by something that I feel could have been improved on. To begin, I love the color in here. It's vibrant and fun and matches Chandra's established personality perfectly. The colorist also knew when to tone it down a little to fit a certain setting or mood without anything becoming drab. Lashley, Ohm, and LaFuente all did excellent jobs all around. I especially enjoy how the fire was colored, and when both your protagonist and antagonist have fire powers, that's important. On the other hand, I unfortunately don't feel as positively towards the art itself. At times, it seems overly simplistic. Faces especially don't always look quite right. Regular Johnny and creepy hallucination of Johnny look more similar than they really should, for example. He is also drawn very young compared to her depictions in card art. I am familiar with some of the artist Tully Bao's past work, and these weren't issues before, so maybe he just wasn't given enough time here. Tully Bao drew all 4 issues of the comic, and I noticed a clear improvement starting with the 3rd, which reinforces my belief that the problem wasn't with the artist. Back to the positives, the majority of the pre-existing characters' personalities are both engaging and in line with prior depictions. Chandra is hot-headed but well-meaning. Ajani is a gentle giant mentor. Tybalt is a try-hard loser. Good stuff all around, with the exception being Pia. Unfortunately, Pia just isn't given a whole lot to do besides be a worried mother. Her job as a politician is mentioned, and we see her do some artificing, but neither of those facets of her character really affects the plot. She is captured by Tybalt off-screen and barely fights against him. It would have been great to see the artificer combat skills that we know she possesses in action. There are a few other characterization choices that I'm not quite sold on as well. Firstly, I have no idea how old Chandra is supposed to read as. On one hand, Pia refers to her as grown, but on the other hand, she lives with her very young-looking mother, who prepares all of her meals for her. I just don't know if Chandra is supposed to be, like 16 or 26. The ages of Magic characters have always been fairly nebulous, so I can't get too upset though. Also, Chandra uses gremlin as a derogative, which is a direct insult to her character. Chandra would never besmirch the noble gremlin. While that specific element of Chandra's characterization confused me, I overall really loved her and her arc in this. The comic tells a surprisingly deep story about mental health and coping with tragedy. While not stated outright, Chandra is clearly suffering from some form of post-traumatic stress disorder from the events of War of the Spark. We see her attempt to cope first by isolating herself from loved ones, avoiding specific locations, and engaging in self-destructive behavior. She also deals with nightmares and has trouble sleeping. All of these are common symptoms of PTSD. By the end of the story, she's made big strides towards improving her state of being, without the complex condition just magically vanishing. It was awesome to see a fictional depiction of PTSD that didn't have the sufferer just get better in a few days. While Chandra is a compelling, complex character here, I wish Tybalt was at the same level. He's a little too one-note for my taste. He likes to hurt people. That's it. No grand schemes, or more ambiguity, or a particularly unique personality. He's not even especially proactive. For the most part, he just shows up to places where bad things are already happening to soak up the bad vibes. Low-key, he's a bit of a second-rate Ashiok. And dear God, the monologuing. He monologues so much. He's constantly just standing there and taking forever to explain his not particularly complex plan. Since he's annoying in-universe and he annoys me, the reader, does that mean that he's actually well written? Probably not. At least we get to see him get his nose broken twice in about 5 minutes. I also enjoy some of the smaller details. There are some legitimately funny moments. There's a specific subtle payoff that really got me. In issue 1, we see a Johnny visit the Noir household, and their cups are absolutely tiny to him. In issue 3, we see Chandra visit Johnny's house, and his cups are giant to her. No one brings it up, it's just a funny and logical visual element that rewards the reader for paying attention. Also, I like to interpret this scene as a Johnny secretly dating Chandra's mom, but that's probably just me. A negative is that the plot just isn't particularly exciting. The character moments with Chandra work really well, but the plot outside of that moves slowly. Too much of the comic retreads the same themes over and over. So much time is spent watching Chandra save random people in contextless settings, or having very similar discussions with either Pia or Johnny. It gets very repetitive, to the point that the story could easily be condensed into 3 issues with little lost. At the very least, it would have been nice if the supporting characters were mixed up a little. I would have loved to see Chandra visit other important people in her life, like Jaya, the other Gatewatch members, or the monks of Regatha. Also, the comic lacks twists. At one point, they attempt to do a cliffhanger and reveal where a totally mysterious person kidnaps Pia and Alar. When only a single villain capable of planeswalking has been introduced, it's not very hard to predict who's to blame. Finally, don't go into the comic expecting it to have a strong impact on the wider Magic story. Even compared to prior Magic books that aren't tied to a set, Chandra doesn't shake things up. Every plot point that gets resolved here was also introduced here. No new planes or major characters are created for the story. The single element of new world building that I noticed was that Bolas' Citadel is still on Ravnica, apparently forever, which I had not been aware of before. Another element that I enjoyed is that there are good payoffs for experienced Magic players. We see at least a snippet of 10 different pre-existing planes. We spend a surprising amount of time on Alara, even though it hasn't been especially relevant to the greater Magic story for some time. We also visit various planes that we know to be important to Chandra's character arc, without the story beating you over the head with exposition. That said, while this was a positive for my reading experience, I could easily see how it could turn some readers away, to the point that I'm going to give that part its own section. But first, I'll try my best to answer the question, is the comic just bad? I would say no, Chandra is not bad, but it is unexciting. There are no surprises, and the pacing is often off. It's just not compelling enough to guarantee consistent readership. It would not be a long shot to bet that this was a big reason for the diminishing numbers with the series. Possibility 2, an unclear audience. Returning to my earlier point, when Chandra was announced, IDW heralded it as a fresh start, and stressed that it would be approachable to everyone. The opening pages of issue 1 suggest that the comic is at least partially intended for casual Magic fans, or even non-fans, explaining concepts like planeswalking, the multiverse, and the Gatewatch. However, Chandra quickly starts relying entirely on Easter eggs, pre-existing characters who go unexplained in the story, and a plot centered wholly on Chandra dealing with her past experiences. If the reader isn't very familiar with the greater Magic story as far back as at least 2015, I just can't see this comic being especially impactful or enjoyable. It's not inherently bad for a comic to be aimed at a narrower audience, but there's always going to be a risk with that approach. You have to be absolutely sure that your comic will really hit the mark with that intended audience, and it appears that Chandra just didn't. Additionally, it's baffling that so much marketing was spent trying to appeal to unfamiliar readers when the comic just isn't written to be approachable to them. I would suggest either playing out a more universally understandable story, or utilizing your limited marketing on the audience that actually has a chance to enjoy it. Speaking of marketing, let's talk about that next. Possibility 3, bad advertising. For all the talk of people considering the Chandra comic and then dropping it, when I brought this video's topic up to my Magic playing friends and Twitter followers, an astounding number of them had no idea what I was talking about. Even though many of these people are full-on Vorthoses, or is Vorthos already plural? Whatever. Even though these people are already very invested in the Magic story, so many of them genuinely had no idea that the Chandra comic even existed until I brought it to their attention. Clearly, the issue goes beyond the comic not keeping people's attention. A mind-boggling number of them weren't even given the chance to know about it. So is Chandra undermarketed? The results demonstrate that it clearly was mismarketed, if nothing else, but I'm having difficulty determining exactly how. When I looked into how Chandra was promoted, I was surprised with what I found. The official Magic the Gathering Twitter account posted about the Chandra comic 6 times. This is 2 to 3 times as much as the far better known War of the Spark, Ikoria, and Children of the Nameless novels, respectively. As far as I can tell, the Throne of Eldraine novel wasn't discussed on that account at all. If you'd asked me before I did this research, I would have predicted that Chandra had received the least amount of promotion. The Chandra comics also didn't include any promotional card inserts, unlike the prior IDW Magic series and earlier Magic comics. Perhaps this too had an impact on fan interest. Regardless of the specifics, the evidence is clearly there that the marketing didn't reach a large enough portion of the Magic player base. Possibility 4. Released at the wrong time. I mentioned earlier that Chandra is difficult for unfamiliar fans to approach. However, its release structure actually makes it so that even the most enfranchised player will still feel unfamiliar with the story. You see, Chandra takes place after the War of the Spark event, but its first 2 issues were released before the War of the Spark set. While there was an exciting element to this decision, it quite possibly ended up being detrimental to the story. Chandra is full of references to the war, but those references are never allowed to be detailed. Chandra and Ajani discuss how they lost someone close to them multiple times, but they aren't allowed to say there was Gideon until the final issue. Gideon juice. The forced vagueness is incredibly distracting. The reader is put into a position where instead of sympathizing with the main characters, they are speculating on what those characters are talking about. To reuse the Spider-Man Far From Home comparison, imagine that it was released before Avengers Endgame, but couldn't reveal anything about that movie. Peter is grieving the loss of someone, but the film never specifies who.
Everywhere I go, I see.
The emotional beats of the story just become so much harder to connect with when the audience is intentionally left in the dark to avoid spoilers for another property. If all of Chandra was released after War of the Spark, with all of the relevant details of war included and unhidden in the story, it would have likely been much more engaging. Meanwhile, another timing issue also potentially affected Chandra. Smack dab in the middle of Chandra's 4 releases, the, I'll be generous and say, controversial War of the Spark novels were released. The novels, Forsaken especially, had such a negative impact on excitement in the Magic story that interest in any Magic fiction would probably take a hit. When you factor in that the character that Forsaken did the dirtiest is the titular protagonist of the Chandra comic, you can't blame anyone for feeling a need to step away from the character for a while. It doesn't help that the second most memed on character from Forsaken plays a major role here too. Possibility 5. Comics are a bad medium for Magic. Magic has a complicated history with comics. In the 90s, Armada published an admirable run of mostly set tie-ins, but the line was eventually cancelled in favor of focusing the Magic story on the Weatherlight Saga. Dark Horse Comics then acquired the license, but published only 4 issues. A few manga publishers have adopted individual Magic storylines over the years, with a single installment per company. The dozens of issues of the Wizards published Duelist magazine contained only a single comic, choosing to focus almost entirely on short stories. Similarly, Magic webcomics ceased in 2011 in favor of text-based fiction. Finally, IDW's prior Magic series was cancelled on a massive cliffhanger after an impressive 17 issues. For the most part, Magic's comic history can be split pretty evenly between one-off non-starters and runs that initially take off but are abruptly ceased. Wizards seems to consistently relearn the lesson that Magic comics are apparently harder to justify from a cost-benefit standpoint than prose. While good Magic comics certainly can and have existed, it would not be unfair to say that Wizards has consistently struggled with getting enough people to read them. Possibility 6. It's a bad time for comics overall. Far beyond the Chandra comic, things just aren't golden in the greater industry. Even before the pandemic drop-kicked everything, the comic industry was feeling the heat. Sales have been declining over the past few years. Comic shops are constantly closing. IDW, the company that published Chandra, has recently experienced multiple executive changes. They hired JP Morgan for assistance with a possible sale in 2019, the same year that Chandra was published. I can't say that this caused Chandra to underperform, but being published by a struggling company in a struggling industry certainly couldn't have helped. Possibility 7. A bad release schedule. When I first looked at the gaps between each issue of Chandra's release, I was disappointed but not surprised. 4 months between issues 1 and 2, 5 months between issues 3 and 4. Plus, issue 1 released a whole month after IDW announced that it would. I say that I was unsurprised because there's nothing I associate with underperforming comics more than an inconsistent release schedule. Massive gaps between installments and consistent schedule slip kills hype so quickly. You cannot blame a reader for losing interest in a story when the last issue came out almost half a year ago. What does surprise me is that issues 2 and 3 had an acceptable gap of only 2 months. I am very curious why the turnaround was so comparatively quick in that instance, and only that instance. Had the entire series had that consistent bi-monthly release schedule, perhaps the sales drop-off would have been less severe. Possibility 8. Behind-the-scenes issues. This takes us to the final possibility that I considered. In the making of this video, I reached out to every writer, artist, and colorist behind Chandra. One who was directly involved with the cancelled Trials of Alara responded with much detail. According to this individual, Wizards was a mix of non-communicative and demanding in regards to their standards. That said, another creative that I corresponded with spoke positively of their experience. Perhaps this lack of consistency in Wizard's communications when it came to Chandra contributed to some of its issues, such as release delays and inconsistent art. In conclusion, no one problem torched Chandra. Rather, almost every step of the process had at least one thing go wrong. The story was unexciting and the illustrations were inconsistent. It was mismarketed and released at a non-optimal time to an unclear and perhaps averse audience. It's a medium that has proven hard for Magic to crack and that is experiencing economic challenges at a large scale. Finally, Wizards may have failed to properly work with their creative talent. All these small and grand factors came together to create a firestorm of disappointment, apathy, and ignorance that Chandra just couldn't overcome. I hope that it can, at a minimum, serve as a learning opportunity for future Magic comics. Some of Chandra's issues went beyond it, or even beyond Magic, but others were very avoidable. I suggest that going forward, Wizards communicates with their creatives better and keeps a specific audience in mind. Here's hoping that their next project doesn't burn out. Thank you very much for watching. Did you read the Chandra comic? If so, what are your thoughts on it? Are there any factors in its problems that you think I missed? If you like this video, please consider liking and subscribing, and have a great day.